Nearly 3 years of forecasting Nintendo, and I'd never made a Smash roster video. What was I thinking? Was I even thinking? The thing is, quite aside from the lack of any imminent Smash content to discuss, there are some problems with doing this. First of all, while I could talk for hours about characters I would like to see, as we all can, that's not a forecast as I define them on this channel. The way I do my forecasts makes Smash lineups rather tricky to call. I try to separate things out into likelihood bands of 10%, 30%, 50%, 70%, and 90% likely, at least according to my own judgment, and then I look back to see how accurate I was, whether my 10% calls came off 10% of the time, my 30% calls came off 30% of the time, and so on. But it doesn't take much examination to realize that, by definition, almost every individual character has really long odds. It could be that the roster will be smaller than Ultimate, which could mean few or potentially even no new characters. On the other hand, if they pivoted to a large first-party roster and a smaller third-party roster, we could see a very different set of characters on the table. There are other problems too. While I have a decent working knowledge on the Nintendo side of things, I've got far less knowledge on third parties, and there are even periods of Nintendo's history to which I paid far less attention to video games than I do now. Generally, I like to use research as a basis for what I do, and while I haven't always got things right along the way, I keep learning. It's very tricky, though, to talk with deep confidence about such a huge range of potential franchises. Finally, while I enjoy Smash fine, I defer to the Smash community for deep cut knowledge, and so any views I might hold, I would hold loosely and be willing to change quite frequently. For all these reasons, it's taken me a while to figure out a good approach to tackling Smash speculation. However, for this video, I've decided to look across Nintendo's first-party franchises to identify which characters could plausibly come to Smash and which are sadly unlikely to receive much or any representation. We'll look at the options for each franchise and to discuss some of the likelier possibilities. I'm not going to do percentages for most individual characters, but I will do a few final forecasts at the end for the people who enjoy that kind of thing. Firstly, a general framing. We know that Nintendo have a lot of input into the roster of these games. It's probably mainly Masahiro Sakurai being diplomatic when he says that Nintendo initiate the choices, but Sakurai's concern is usually about balance for the whole roster and making interesting mechanics with the chosen characters. All things considered, therefore, we should probably assume that there will be a general bias towards Nintendo's corporate priorities, including pushing characters who are prominent in current or imminent Nintendo titles. Then again, one of their corporate priorities is literally to surprise and delight its audience, so there's a limit to how far that will really get us. Okay, without further ado then, let's start with the biggest mainline franchise, and this is the Mario franchise, starting with the core Mario characters and then working out towards the spin-off possibilities. It's not impossible that we could get a game with just the existing Mario people, especially if the next roster is slimmed down, but it feels hugely unlikely, and I think we probably will get some kind of additional Mario representation. I think the most likely addition to Smash, who probably wouldn't thrill anyone, is Toad. Through the film, Toad has become a pretty big character, and with Toadette and Captain Toad, the character has many variants who could be leveraged for different versions of the characters. The character is surely the most valuable Nintendo own who isn't represented in Smash, and while he might not be the most thrilling, he has to be more likely than most other options. They might even be able to rope in Nabbit as a variant since they really like that character, although while Nabbit has the same body shape, his speed is slightly different. Another popular pick is Waluigi, but I'm more skeptical that we will see any representation from Waluigi. On the one hand, he seems to have potential for Nintendo in the medium to long term as a new character to explore through the films, but he's still someone of pretty niche interest and isn't intrinsically that interesting a character. I know there's a fan base who long to see Waluigi in Smash, and I'm not against the guy, but between these people who are just touting him ironically and those who are pushing him because he's kind of an obvious next pick, I'm not quite sure if the groundswell of Waluigi passion runs actually all that deep. Kamek in this sense seems a lot more promising, especially since he was fairly prominent in the films, and actually, of all the characters in the Mario universe, Kamek's ability to fly offers the most obvious potential for something different in gameplay terms, while also presumably being very difficult to balance unless his magic runs out. I have a feeling that in the long history of Smash, Kamek must have been at least considered and probably ruled out by Sakurai, but that also means he's had years and perhaps decades to figure out an angle on this rather intriguing villainous sidekick. While there is room to doubt all of these Mario picks, they all do have individual name recognition, but another promising source would be the same treasure trove that Mario Kart World raided, the side characters like Monty Mole and indeed Cow. I'm not sure that Cow has quite maintained the necessary momentum of her fame right after launch, and while I think she'd be a bovine addition to the roster, I think they could have a stage that references Mario Kart World without necessarily using a precious character spot. Personally, I think Chain Chomp also has huge potential and would certainly play differently, but there's an absolute vast array of these kinds of characters who could be used, and I'm not going to go through them all. Then there's the potential for yet more variants of Mario, Baby Mario, Paper Mario, Mario and Luigi Mario, possibly even Movie Mario. I'm not sure about any of these really. Paper Mario has a lot of potential, or at least did years ago, but now these games feel kinda peripheral to the march of Nintendo's Mario RPG ambitions, with Mario and Luigi, Super Mario RPG, and even Mario plus Rabbids kind of crowding out the classic paper format with other RPG formats for Mario. For sure, Paper Mario could tout some interesting moves though, and the stage would look terrific. The return of the Thousand Year Door also may give an opportunity to bring back some of the iconic side cast as well, but in general I'm skeptical that anyone who appeared as a side character in a Mario RPG is going to get much of a look in. The movie version might also have a few too many financial considerations, with Universal and Illumination needing to be cut in for something that doesn't immediately feel likely to benefit Nintendo in any major way. They want to draw people from the movies to the games, not from the games to the movies. If they're going to go for a Mario variant, Mario with Cappy might seem more logical, but since Odyssey is now well in the rearview mirror, that too seems improbable, and also they've kind of got more potential for that kind of thing with Kirby. Of course, perhaps the most likely new character is one I've saved because technically it's someone now more closely associated with the spin-off, specifically Pauline. Classic Mario Universe Pauline perhaps might have felt a little too close to Peach and Daisy, but new child singer Bonandium root hunting Pauline feels like someone Nintendo could hardly overlook. The character has always had vast potential, and I think that's even more apparent now. The world of Donkey Kong obviously has considerable potential in itself, but it's hard to know exactly how Nintendo will take this right now, with the Donkey Kong outlook still so up in the air. Donkey Kong Diddy and King K. Rool is already a decent representation, but I think Pauline would obviate the need for Dixie, who feels a little bit ancillary these days, and I don't know what Funky Kong would really add, unless perhaps an Echo Fighter version of Donkey Kong. However, Cranky and Rambi, either separately or perhaps together, would certainly add something new, and the characters are ones that Nintendo obviously want to push. I really like the idea of some kind of combo of the two, and I'm also reminded of Nintendo's current wish to push into the family space at this phase of their evolution, and a cranky granddad character kind of fits into their vision of having characters appeal cross-generationally. There's also an extreme outside chance of another Donkey Kong face though, Donkey Kong Jr. Nintendo and anniversaries are fickle friends, but the Donkey Kong 50th and the likelihood of an upcoming Donkey Kong film might be an opportunity to pay tribute to this classic of the arcade era, whether reimagined or still in 8-bit glory. I also think the time has come for some more Luigi's Mansion representation. Luigi's Mansion 3 outsold Splatoon 2 on last count. If it weren't under the Mario umbrella, it would be one of Nintendo's top franchises in its own right, and you can bet there'll be a film in the offing over the next decade or so. Whether it's Professor Egad or Luigi or perhaps more obviously King Boo, I'm not sure, but I feel like this roster needs deepening. Of all of them, King Boo feels like the character who would diversify the gameplay the most, but Luigi could be the easiest to implement as an Echo Fighter for Luigi. Moseying on over to the Yoshi corner of the sky, the obvious character to bring over here is Poochie. The new Yoshi title seems conspicuously Poochie-less, and until or unless they port Woolly World, perhaps Poochie will remain in his kennel. It's not entirely clear either what Poochie would add, especially since Nintendo has more promising canine-shaped characters to explore. For the same reason, I'm not sure I see Polterpup making it as a unique character, although there is certainly one canine companion that I will come to later on who I think will potentially make the cut. Then we get to Wario. In recent times, Nintendo has shown little interest in Wario and himself, but the inclusion of WarioWare among the selectable favourites on Nintendo today, and the fact that WarioWare games are cheap and cheerful to put out, and potentially the microgame format could be quite flexible beyond simply console gaming, means I wouldn't count Wario representation out. Captain Syrup is the most obvious shout for the Wario Land version of the series, but there are a number of cool WarioWare characters, and the fact that WarioWare featured as a design in its own right on Nintendo today makes me feel like Nintendo have more of an aspiration for WarioWare than Wario Land. They're all pretty interesting and have great possibilities. The issue with Ashley, I suppose, is that if you're going to choose a witchy rep, Kamek is far more prominent. I'm sure there are also many people at Nintendo who long to beat up Pyro, fictionally of course, but that's another matter. But the thing is, WarioWare has such unique properties that I wonder if there's space for WarioWare Inc. itself to be a character, with the players having 10 seconds to acclimatise to the fighter they've been given before it randomly swaps out for someone else in the mix. This would be an absolute nightmare to program for, as it would mean multiple characters for the space of one, and I imagine it would inject a bit too much randomness into competitive modes for people to be able to manage unless the characters were balanced insanely well, but it would be a tremendous utilisation of the concept and this cast if they could ever pull it off. Finally, let's talk about the ultra niche characters. Rabbid Peach might once have had a very decent chance of making the lineup, and for all we know, the lines of communication between Nintendo and Ubisoft are still open. But with Davide Soliani's decision to start his own studio developing an original title, and given that Ubisoft themselves branded Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope sales disappointing, I don't know I see Nintendo rushing to resuscitate this spin-off line. Then again, they did go out of their way to revive Super Mario RPG, and they must be aware of the huge groundswell of love for Geno. They would likely be negotiating here with Square for other characters anyway, and even if they weren't, they have a close relationship with Square and even own some Square Enix stock. So even if Nintendo decided to move Smash onto a first-party focused footing, keeping Square invested through the inclusion of Geno might make some sense. Sometimes the point is just to surprise and delight, and for this reason, while Geno will always remain a tremendous long shot, I don't think he's completely out of the question. Or maybe they'll just put in Mallow just to mess with everyone. I'm sure I've missed some obvious candidates for the Mario universe, and I apologise if I've skipped over anyone's favourites, but for now, let's pivot over to the Zelda games. Here is the problem with Zelda. The big characters have kind of already been done. We have Zelda, Sheik, Ganondorf, and multiple links. The real way to put the characters over the top would be to have four, one from each of the main Hylian species. This is where the film comes in. It seems unlikely to me that all four major races of Hyrule won't find representation in the forthcoming film, or at least the film series, and if so, would Nintendo want to limit themselves to just one of them? Perhaps they'd be better off with a generic or new representative of each race, possibly with the capability to summon into being ancestors from the various games. This would certainly open a large range of character types, and it would make the characters fairly resilient to changes going forward. If Nintendo wanted to make Zelda as promising for merchandise as Mario, then a good start would be making the four races of Hyrule as iconic as Link, and doing all four is still very unlikely, but not so unlikely as other possibilities on this list, so I think it is worth mentioning. But they could go a different route entirely and choose one of the monsters, and of all the enemies in Hyrule, surely the bokoblins would be the most fun. Breath of the Wild made them really entertaining to watch, and I have a feeling that the film will only make them more popular, plus it wouldn't surprise me if Sakurai did something with the various bokoblin colours. Of course, this may be another opportunity to bring in multiple enemies at once. Perhaps bokoblin can summon moblins and even hinoxes, but would of course need to duck out of the way to avoid being thrown around the stage by them. Then there are other characters. Tingle. Personally, I'd dearly love to see Marin from Link's Awakening, but I think that dream is probably done. Dunpei, on the other hand, feels kind of like the side character that they might see value in resurrecting, and of course, there's always Impa, who I suspect may be a more prominent character through the film, and just as I mentioned with Cranky Kong, having an older female character might be beneficial to Nintendo in their pitch to be at the centre of cross-generational gameplay experiences. It's hard to say because, of course, we don't exactly know what Impa will do in terms of the film and even the next game, but I could definitely see her becoming more prominent as time goes by. More tricky to represent in Smash might be the fairies, given that there are so many different takes on these characters and the fact that they are usually static. Finally, there's the possibility of game-specific tie-in characters. If Nintendo aims to bring back Majora's Mask or Twilight Princess, then making mask-wearing Link or Wolf Link and Midna playable characters might have some appeal, and the likelihood feels to me to be quite high that both games will make an appearance sometime this generation on the Switch 2 hardware. Still, with so many Zelda options on the table, I'm not quite sure there's another option that stands out to me right now. I think Mario and Zelda are the most likely franchises where there's any slim potential that they have multiple representatives added. From here and for the next several franchises, we're dealing with ones where I think a new inclusion feels plausible, but the specifics as to who aren't always obvious. So, for Metroid, the most obvious character in terms of recent fame would be Ravenbeak and Sylux. Sylux is probably a little ahead in terms of potential here, as Sylux has had more appearances and a more recent appearance, but at the time of recording, which is before Metroid Prime 4 Beyond releases, I'd feel a lot more hyped about Ravenbeak, but maybe they'll just chuck in Miles to freak everyone out again. Animal Crossing, on the other hand, has a near endless supply of characters who could be included, but Tom Nook feels like the current standout character, perhaps with Timmy and Tommy along for the ride to add some gameplay variety. Then again, it very much depends on where the next game goes. KK Slider might have more potential and is iconic. Gulliver and Mabel will be personal favourites of mine, and who knows, perhaps the next game will make Mr. Rossetti a major figure and justify his incorporation as a Smash fighter. Incidentally, I scripted this section, and the very next day, Nintendo dropped news that Rossetti would be added to Animal Crossing in the 3.0 update. Pretty awesome. Now I just need to figure out how I did it and make this work for Advance Wars. Anyway, of all the franchises, I think Animal Crossing is probably the one that's hardest to call in terms of future representation, and it will probably depend a lot on their plans for the next game, which we might not see for a couple of years yet. Then there's Splatoon. I think this is a hard call for different reasons, which is that by the time a new Splatoon is ready to drop, it's likely that there will be a new character to include. So while Deep Cut would currently be the obvious ones, they could be a Deep Cut in a few years' time, although to be fair, their apparently elevated presence in Splatoon Raiders probably gives them a bit more of a chance all the same. Personally, I'd be on Team Pearl and Mariner, and it may be that they're looking to bring these characters back in Splatoon 4 after a bit of a break. I could imagine Nintendo of America especially wanting to have a character who presents as black to put into their adverts, so I could definitely see Mariner getting the nod either as a tag team with Pearl or solo. Okay, Pikmin. Is there really another option other than Ochi? I guess the interesting one would be Bulborb, and theoretically if Sakurai overcame the problem of Ridley's huge size, perhaps he could overcome the problem of the Pikmin's small size and have the characters themselves as fighters. Still, I think Ochi has the most potential here, all the more because Sakurai has talked before about wanting to find characters with different body types, not just endless sword users, and Ochi is definitely different. Kirby is another one that surely would get a look in if Nintendo is wanting to extend representation to different franchises. As Kirby's creator, Sakurai has a huge history with these characters, including recently through Air Riders, but also the franchise has hit new heights since Forgotten Land, especially, and there's a lot of potential in the series. Bandana Waddle Dee feels criminally overlooked at this point, but note also that Magalog got his own side quest in Return to Dreamland Deluxe, and may be a character that they see more potential in. Again though, thinking of characters with the biggest appeal to casual families, I can't really look past Rick. He's a massive hamster, surely the absolute winner for any family who own a pet hamster, of which there must be quite a number. Then again, Chef Kawasaki is also the kind of character who might appeal to people, and the chance to bring in lots of foodstuffs into the game could be an appealing addition. The fact is, I think the field is very open with Kirby, and there's not any particular obvious candidate for the next slot from that series. Pokemon is also tough for me personally. The field is vast and would take all day to sort through, and I'm not a massive follower of this franchise, and so I can't really see any criteria to narrow it down. Let me know in the comments if you have a good insight into this. Fire Emblem is also oddly difficult, just because there are new characters every few years, and I would therefore expect a character from Fortune's Weave to take the slot. Given that they seem to be bringing back Sothis, perhaps she's in the lead at this point as she's bringing a different energy to the proceedings. On the other hand, of course, they might not have a new character from Fire Emblem, given that they already have a number, and if they're not adding that many new characters to the game, perhaps Fire Emblem will get overlooked, with the roster instead focusing on the franchises which have grown a lot more in recent years. After all, how many Fire Emblem sword fighters can we really cope with? On the other hand, even if there is a new Xenoblade beforehand, I still think a Xenoblade Chronicles 3 representative is a good shout, as I do think Nintendo likes to honour these games. Noah here feels like the obvious shout, I guess, but perhaps there are other possibilities that I'm not thinking of. It's possible we could see more characters from Star Fox, F-Zero, Punch-Out, Kid Icarus, and others, but all of these feel like long shots given the low profile of these series at the moment, though that could change if any of them roar back. I also think an Advance Wars pick seems incredibly unlikely, as does anyone from Golden Sun, but for more on that franchise's fate, see my separate full deep dive, which is either out now or coming very soon. However, there are a few characters from smaller franchises which are worth a shout, mostly ones who have returned in recent years and have become quite prominent. Firstly, Ayumi Tachibana has appeared in 3 games since Smash Ultimate and is now fairly iconic amongst smaller franchises. She would be an awesome pick, and I think Nintendo would be very happy to push Famicom Detective Club to a slightly higher profile. Less likely would be Ashley from Another Code. Another Code is primarily a Nintendo-driven franchise, even though Nintendo have supported and published it, and it doesn't appear to be a tremendous seller, so on balance, I think Tachibana is the most likely character of this type. A random possibility, but one option they could do is to have a drag and drive character. Drag and Drive didn't exactly set the world on fire, and its visual style was pretty bland, but Wheelchair Basketballer would, of necessity, play completely differently from other Smash characters. And if they're thinking of the title as a party game where everyone can find a character who appeals to them, again, having a wheelchair user might be an asset for their promotional departments. Quite significant people, including the producers of Mario Kart, ARMS and Splatoon, had a hand in this game, so I think it's quite dear to Nintendo's hearts, even if it didn't exactly enthrall the hearts of many gamers. I'm sure it would be greeted as a random appearance, but with the caveat that all of these are intrinsically huge long shots, I think this is a shorter shot than many. One character long rumoured but who seems unlikely still is Takamaru. I've covered Takamaru in another video. While I think Nintendo likes to honour their history and mysterious Murasami Castle's appearance on Nintendo Switch Online has probably helped the character's profile, I don't think they'd want to use a slot promoting a character they don't have at least some potential to make sales from. However, in an odd way, I think that there is an aspect in which this could actually push Takamaru forward. You see, one of the pillars of Nintendo's content strategy is their retro titles and their deep-cut content library. We've seen this with Nintendo Classics and titles like Nintendo World Championship, we've seen it with the retro theme on Nintendo Today, and with their focus on nostalgia generally, to the Nintendo Museum, Takamaru's cameos on Mario Maker, and so on. Having a character who kind of serves as the patron saint of the 1980s era of the nostalgic days of yore does make some kind of sense in this context, and Takamaru does have potential in an IP era, given that it's a wholly owned Nintendo franchise in which a samurai fights aliens. I mean, that has to be a hit in waiting. So I think Takamaru is far more likely than we think, although that's still with the caveat that he is hugely unlikely overall. Skimming off the most likely characters from each franchise then, the first party picks that feel like they have the most potential would be Toad Toadette, Impa, Bokoblin, Pauline, Cranky, Silux, Chef Kawasaki, Marina Ochi, KK Slider, Sothis, Noah, Tachibana, Dragon Drive player, Takamaru, and Rick. This has a mix of characters who are iconic in different ways, but also of a range of different body types, personality types, and appearances that would appeal to growing families representing a variety of age and body types and interests. If Nintendo do indeed, as I've speculated, look to move towards a first-party focused Smash sequel, then I could see a number of these potentially making an appearance. As I mentioned at the top of the video, making a forecast in these circumstances would be clearly crazy. However, there are a few things that I think we can say. One 70% chance to me is that the next original Smash game will see at least 3 new characters at launch, even if there are cuts to the overall numbers of fighters for one reason or another. If they don't have new characters at launch, I guess it's probably because they've decided to develop a prior version of the game and are saving a full new title for later on down the line. I think the likeliest individual character is probably Pauline, and I think Pauline's appearance is 30% likely outright if there is a Smash that has a new character by the end of 2029. I think Ayumi Tachibana is a 10% outright shot as well. Under normal circumstances, 10% are my long shots, but in this context, that's quite a big boost. I'd say a new Kirby character feels like a 30% chance as well, especially given the heightened popularity of the franchise. Finally, I think there's a 50% chance that we see at least 2 out of my list of Toad Toadette, Impa, Dompe, Cranky Kong, Silex, Chef Kawasaki, Mariner, Ochi, KK Slider, Sothis, Noah, Dragon Drive Player, Takamaru, and Rick. If Smash is as far away as we expect, I dare say I'll circle back to this topic in years ahead, so I'm going to stop at this point, but do let me know which characters you're tipping yourselves. The other videos on screen have more Smash forecasting, and please consider checking out the Patreon, which really helps me out. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.